In our last lecture, we began to consider how different species that happen to coexist in the same space might interact. We started this discussion by considering the kinds of interactions in general that we might observe in terms of whether the interaction had a positive or a negative effect on either of the two interacting species. We then began to look at one particularly important kind of interaction, namely the interaction between a predator and its prey. We saw how a predator-prey interaction might influence the abundance, or in other words, the population sizes of both species, with the prediction that such an interaction might lead to cyclic changes in population sizes of both species, with changes in the predator's population size lagging behind changes in the prey's population size. Now, in today's lecture, we're going to continue our exploration of how species in a biological community may interact with each other. We'll begin by looking in some more detail at cases where one species benefits and the other species is harmed, that is, predator-prey or host-parasite interactions. We'll then shift our attention to looking at interactions where both species in an interaction might be harmed by the other's presence. That is, we'll turn our attention to the ecological interaction we call competition. Now, before going on, I want to emphasize two broad issues that I'd like you to keep in mind throughout today's lecture. The first issue concerns the problem of how we can infer the causal process that's responsible for a pattern we observe in nature. When we're examining biological systems, especially at higher levels of organization, such as the levels of populations or communities or ecosystems, we often begin an analysis by observing a pattern. For example, when we considered the effects of the predator-prey interaction last time between snowshoe hares and their predators, the lynx, we began by noticing that there was a strong cyclic change in the population size of both species and that these changes were correlated. Now, this pattern suggested a process, or really a mechanism. It suggested a process that might be responsible for generating this pattern, that might be responsible. Now, the process that we considered was the possibility that the fact that the lynx eat the hares would change the relative population sizes in a regular pattern, as we discussed last time. But, and here's the point I want you to keep in mind, the existence of the pattern doesn't necessarily prove the process. In fact, we saw last time that the cyclic changes in the hare's population really probably weren't driven by their interaction with their predator, but instead were driven by their interaction with their own prey, so to speak, the plant species that they eat. So in general, the point I want you to keep in mind is that to understand process more completely, we need to do experiments. We start with the pattern and we develop a hypothesis, but then we test that hypothesis by doing an experiment. Now, in ecology, the trick is to be able to design an experiment that you can do in the field. It's not surprising, therefore, that ecologists often stand out among biologists as being some of the best and most sophisticated experimentalists. Now, the second theme I want you to keep in mind today is simply to remind you that in general, the fundamental issue that concerns ecologists, or at least one of the main issues that concern ecologists, is to somehow account for the abundance and distribution of species in different places. Now, our discussion last time really dealt simply with abundance, relative population size. We were concerned, for example, with explaining why there were changes in population sizes of the hares and the lynx. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about both abundance and distribution, whether a species even exists in a particular place, and how ecological interactions might help us account for that. Okay, now let's return to where we were last time by looking at the effects of another kind of interaction between two species where one species benefits and another species is harmed. Now, this case differs in that it's not a predator-prey interaction, but instead an interaction between a parasite and its host. Populations of red grouse in Great Britain, this is a large ground bird, very often show a very strong cyclic fluctuation in the size of their population. Now, the length of this cycle varies from place to place. It's usually around 4 years. It may be as long as 8 years. And the magnitude of this fluctuation can be quite great. In fact, you can go from a size of a local population numbering in the thousands of individuals at its peak down to a trough of really that local population being diminished to just a handful of individuals. And this occurs in a regular cyclic pattern, suggesting that it may have something to do with the kinds of mechanisms that we've already talked about. Now, one difference with this red grouse population cycle from what we've seen so far is that there doesn't appear to be any corresponding cycle in, for example, a prey species that might prey on the grouse, or, for example, a food species that the grouse themselves might be eating. Instead, as I said, it seems as though this cycle is driven by a host-parasite interaction. Specifically, researchers suggested that the cycle is driven by a parasitic roundworm that infects the grouse. Now, the hypothesis suggested that at high grouse densities, it's easier for the roundworm parasite to be transmitted between individuals. This is simply because at higher densities, literally, the grouse bump into each other more. They're more tightly packed. Remember, this was one of the costs of group living that we talked about when we were talking about behavioral ecology a number of lectures ago. Also, as the density of grouse populations increase, the amount of food available to any one grouse is diminished, and this also could contribute to grouse being less able to fend off infection or the negative effects of infection of these parasitic roundworms. So this hypothesis suggests a slightly different mechanism by which this parasite affects the abundance of its host. It's not that the size of the parasite population is going up and down and really matters. It's that the size of the grouse population itself makes grouse more or less susceptible to being affected by the parasite. So how can we test this pattern? Well, the way that researchers did this was to treat several grouse populations with a drug that killed the roundworm parasites. This was actually a fairly massive effort, and this is usually the problem with doing ecological experiments, because it was necessary to treat several thousand grouse in a population so that they would all have this drug and therefore be rid of the parasitic roundworms. But when researchers did this, they indeed found that the cycling of the grouse population stopped. The grouse would reach some peak population and stay there as long as the parasite was not present at the population, whereas other populations where the parasite remained continued to show the regular 4-year, quite extensive cycling. Well, okay, so now we've looked at a couple of examples of how predator-prey or host-parasite interactions can affect the abundances of one species or both species in the interaction. Now, in some cases, you might imagine that the increased mortality due, for example, to the presence of a predator or even a parasite might be so strong that it would lead to the complete elimination of a prey population in some local area. In this instance, then, the interaction between a prey and a predator would affect not only the abundance of the prey species, but actually the distribution of the prey species, whether the prey species could exist someplace or not because of the presence of a predator. Now, I should point out that we would expect this kind of effect to occur more frequently in communities where predators are generalists, as opposed to places, or cases, I should say, where predators are specialists. By specialist, I mean a case where a predator or a parasite really relies only on a single kind of food resource, perhaps only a single species. In a sense, our general theoretical model that we've taken to thinking about predator-prey interactions up to this point has assumed that. We've only been looking at interactions between two species, so the idea here is that there's only one thing that the predator can eat. Well, clearly this isn't the situation we want to be thinking about now, because if all of the prey are gone, then of course all the predators will be gone and we'll have no community at all. And that's in fact why extreme specialist predators are relatively rare. More generally, predators are what we would refer to as generalists. I should say more commonly, predators are what we refer to as generalists. Generalist predators may consume a variety of different kinds of species. They'll actually generally consume whatever is most available to them in the environment. And it's here where the interaction between a predator and its prey may affect the distribution of prey species by causing prey to go locally extinct. Let me make this point clear by giving you another example. This example is work done on populations of frogs by an ecologist named Josh Van Buskirk, who was a graduate student at Duke University, as it turns out, when he did this work. As you probably know, frogs breed in water. Okay? Their juvenile stage, what we call tadpoles, must live in the water, so frogs lay their eggs in the water, and the tadpoles will spend a considerable amount of time, well, it depends on the species, but they'll spend some time in a pond or a lake or another body of water before the tadpoles eventually mature, turn into adult frogs, and then move out of the water, or perhaps are able to move out of the water. Now, Van Buskirk was working on a species of frog called the western chorus frog. This kind of frog actually breeds throughout southeast Canada and down through the midwestern United States. Specifically, Van Buskirk was looking at patterns of the abundance and distribution of chorus frogs on islands in Lake Superior. And he stumbled upon an interesting pattern when he was looking at this. Van Buskirk found that tadpoles of these frogs would only be found in a subset of the ponds occurring on these islands, but all of the ponds, at least at first impression, seemed identical to Van Buskirk. So the question really was, why are frogs found in one pond and not another? All these ponds seemed like they're fine places for the frogs to breed, but they would only occur in some of them, not all of them. In other words, what Van Buskirk then became interested in asking is what's determining the distribution of the species of frog in these pond communities. Now, a closer look showed that the ponds from which the frogs were absent happened to also include populations of dragonfly nymphs. Dragonfly nymphs are also a juvenile stage. You all probably are familiar with dragonflies. They're predatory insects that we see flying around wetlands and ponds and so forth. Well, the juvenile stage of dragonflies are completely aquatic. Dragonflies lay their eggs in the water as well, and these dragonfly nymphs themselves are voracious generalist predators. So, what Van Buskirk found was if nymphs were present in a pond, the frogs were absent. And frogs appeared to only occur in ponds where the nymphs happened to be absent. The pattern that Van Buskirk observed then suggested that the presence of the predator, the dragonfly nymph, restricts the distribution of the prey species. In other words, the dragonfly's distribution is driving the frog's distribution, the tadpole distribution, because of a predator-prey interaction. Now, as we saw in the case of population cycles, this pattern that Van Buskirk observed suggested a specific process. The process being that the dragonfly nymphs would be too strong a predator for the tadpoles. But this was a process that had to be tested experimentally. And this is exactly what Van Buskirk did. Now, the idea behind Van Buskirk's experiments is really a very common approach to doing experimental community ecology. And specifically, what Van Buskirk did was to manipulate the presence or absence of one or the other species and see how that affected the distribution of the other. Van Buskirk did two experiments, really. Now, in the first experiment, Van Buskirk selected two ponds, both of which contained tadpoles but didn't have any dragonfly nymphs. Now, I should say that actually the way you do this in ecology is not just to select two ponds, but in fact you would select a sample of ponds. And so when I say two ponds, I really would mean a sample of one pond and a sample of the other pond. Now, the contrast here is that what Van Buskirk wanted to do was ask if he added tadpoles to one of these ponds, if he added dragonfly nymphs, the predators, to one of these ponds, what would happen to the size of the tadpole population? So in one of these ponds, remember these ponds all start out with tadpoles and no dragonfly nymphs. And in one of these ponds, what Van Buskirk did was just leave it unmanipulated. He just left it as a control. He just wanted to measure what would be the fate of tadpoles over a several-week period. How many would survive? Would they survive if he just left that pond alone? But in an identical pond, an identical kind of pond starting out with tadpoles, Van Buskirk added dragonfly nymphs. He actually added about the density of nymphs that you would find in a normal pond. So now we've got a contrast. Both ponds started out with tadpoles and no nymphs. To one pond, Van Buskirk adds nymphs, and he asks what happens. Well, in the pond where he starts out with tadpoles and just leaves it unmanipulated, not surprisingly, he found that some of the tadpoles died over the several weeks it took them to mature, but many of them survived. On the other hand, in the pond to which he had added the dragonfly nymphs, within a couple of weeks, all the tadpoles were gone. Now, the conclusion of this experiment is actually pretty straightforward. It is consistent with the hypothesis that the presence of the dragonflies is somehow limiting the distribution of the tadpoles. But this experiment really isn't taking us far enough. In other words, the problem with this experiment is that Van Buskirk could have just been throwing a monkey wrench into ponds that had distributions of tadpoles determined for other reasons. I mean, it's not surprising if you know that the dragonflies eat tadpoles, that when you add dragonflies to a pond full of tadpoles, that the tadpoles get eaten. The more important experiment was the second experiment that Van Buskirk did. What he did in this case is again select two ponds, or sets of two ponds, but both of these ponds started out with no tadpoles present and had dragonflies. So it's just the reverse of the first experiment. Now what he did was, for one of these ponds, he actually would remove the dragonflies and add tadpoles. So now, after the manipulation, we've got a pond where there are no dragonflies, even though there were at the start, and now there are a bunch of tadpoles. To the second pond, what he did was just throw in tadpoles, leaving the dragonflies there. And he would throw in several hundreds of tadpoles in both of these cases. Now again, the experimental contrast here was, in one pond we have tadpoles without dragonflies. In the other pond we have tadpoles and dragonflies. This is like the first experiment, but with a key difference. And the key difference is that the starting point for these ponds was to not have any tadpoles present. Well, what happened? Well, in ponds where he had removed the nymphs and added tadpoles, again, some of the tadpoles died over several weeks, but many of them survived and emerged as adults. And again, not surprisingly, in the pond that started out with dragonflies, where hundreds of tadpoles were added, pretty quickly those tadpoles were eaten by the dragonflies. Now, the key point about this experiment is that it demonstrates that the ponds where no tadpoles were found that had dragonfly nymphs could support populations of tadpoles. In other words, the lack of tadpoles in these ponds could be attributed more directly to the presence of the predator. An alternative possibility is that there's some ecological condition, maybe water chemistry or something like that, that differs between ponds, and based on water chemistry you'll find tadpoles in some ponds and dragonflies in other ponds. But what Van Buskirk was able to show with this second experiment is that ponds that didn't normally have tadpoles could sustain a population of tadpoles as long as the dragonflies were eliminated. And that was that allowed him to conclude relatively definitively that it is the presence of the predator that determines the distribution of the prey in this case. Now, lest you think that this is all figured out, I'd just like to point out that there are still some questions that emerge from this kind of analysis. For example, what determined the distribution of the dragonfly nymphs in the first place? Why are they in some ponds and not others? We'll leave that question to later when we start talking about other kinds of factors that affect distribution and abundance of species. Well, now that we've looked at predator-prey interactions, what I want to do is I want to turn our attention to competition. As I told you last time, along with predator-prey interactions, competition is thought to be one of the major ecological interactions that affects the abundance and distribution of species in a biological community. Now, predator-prey interactions, along with things like host-parasite interactions, really represent cases where one species is using the other as a resource, right? One species is eating the other. By contrast, competition occurs when two species in a community rely on the same common resource. And in fact, when those resources on which they are relying are limiting in some way. Now, as I mentioned in the last lecture, the effect of interspecific competition, that is, competition between two species, is conceptually similar to the effect of intraspecific competition. And we discussed this earlier in the context of the logistic growth model. Remember, the logistic growth model was a model that explicitly included the idea that if you have many individuals of a species competing for the same resource, the more individuals that there are there, the more finely they have to divide those resources. When we're talking about competition, we're talking about the same thing, but now what we're talking about is several, at least two or more species competing for some common resource. As resources become limiting, just as we saw in intraspecific competition with logistic growth, then we would expect in interspecific competition that we would see some effect on the distribution and especially perhaps the abundance of one or the other species. Now, in the 1920s, two mathematicians, an American named Alfred J. Lotka and an Italian named Vittore Volterra, independently derived a way to model mathematically the effects of interspecific competition on population growth. And the way they did this was by modifying the logistic growth model. Now, the logistic growth model itself, remember, is a modification of the exponential model of population growth that we discussed several lectures ago. The exponential model for population growth, just to remind you, is dn over dt equals Rn. And I'll remind you that what those terms mean really in English is that the population size, the change in the population size dn per unit time over dt is going to be equal to the per capita growth rate of a species, that's what R is, times the number of individuals in that population at any one time. N. So in other words, dn over dt equals R times n. The logistic growth equation, you'll recall, added another term to this, a term that included the carrying capacity, and the symbol for the carrying capacity was K, you'll remember. So what we did was we added the term K minus N over K to the logistic growth equation to give us to the exponential growth equation to give us the logistic growth equation. K being the carrying capacity minus the number of individuals in a population at one time, K minus N, will go to 0 as the size of the population N approaches the carrying capacity K, right? As N gets closer and closer to K, K minus N becomes 0. So the term K minus N over K approaches 0 as N increases. And so growth rate overall, the solution to this equation, will go to 0. So the idea behind logistic growth is that we expect growth rate to continue to decrease and eventually reach 0 as the carrying capacity is reached. Now, what both Lotka and Volterra realized is that when two species are in competition for the same resource, each species effectively contributes individuals to the total number of individuals that an environment can handle in terms of its total carrying capacity. In other words, individuals of one species need to be counted somehow against the carrying capacity of the other species, because they're using up some of the same resources. This conclusion is sort of intuitively sensible, because if a competing species is using up some resource, then that resource isn't available for the other species. And it would be as though there were more individuals of that other species. So you might think of it this way. The carrying capacity of a species depends on the amount of resources available in the habitat. If there are a lot of resources, then the carrying capacity will be larger than if there is fewer resources. And the presence of a competing species essentially uses up these resources and so effectively lowers the carrying capacity for the species in which it's in competition. Another way to think of this is that the population size of the competing species has to contribute to our equation of logistic growth for the species that we're interested in. Now, the way that Lotka and Volterra saw to do this was by further modifying that term K minus N over K, the term that we added to logistic growth. They did this by adding a variable that represents the population size of the competing species multiplied by another term that they called the competition coefficient. And this became what has become known, or this equation is now known as the Lotka-Volterra equation. And it goes like this. I'll just spell this out for you. You might jot it down, but I'll tell you what it means in English. Now, the Lotka-Volterra equation, if we're interested in the growth of a species that's in competition with another species, we'd write the equation as dn sub 1 over dt equals r sub 1 times n sub 1 times k sub 1 minus n sub 1 minus alpha, that's the competition coefficient, times n sub 2 over k sub 1. Now, what are all these terms? We added some new words to this equation. All right, what we've done specifically is added these subscripts to the terms n, and R and K. So we know what species we're talking about. So N sub 1 means the population of species 1. R sub 1 means the growth rate of species 1. K sub 1 is the carrying capacity of species 1. All we've done really is added that completely new term, alpha N sub 2, to that logistic growth part of this equation. So we have K sub 1 minus N sub 1 minus alpha N sub 2 over K sub 1. So we've just added the population size of the competing species, that's N sub 2, multiplied by a fraction, alpha, which represents how much these species are in competition. Now, a way to think about this is that if these species are not in complete competition, in other words, they don't use exactly the same resources, then an individual of the second species, that would be the species represented by N sub 2, doesn't count as much as an individual of the first species. Now, in common practice, this competition coefficient alpha will range from 0, in which case there's no competition between the two species, right? And if we had alpha equals 0, then our equation just simply becomes the same as it was before for logistic growth, k minus n over k, because alpha is 0, we don't have to worry about the n2. Or in theory, it could range up to 1. Actually, in theory, it could range higher, but let's let it go to 1, in which case an individual of the second species counts as much against the carrying capacity as an individual of the first species. More realistically, usually alpha is going to be somewhere in between because species aren't going to be in complete competition. So the key point here to the Lotka-Volterra equations is that we've added a way of including the population size of a competing species devalued by a competition coefficient. All right. Now, if two species are competing at all, the Lotka-Volterra equations suggested that, in fact, over some period of time, only one species will be able to survive the interaction. Now, I should point out that there are really usually two equations we have to think about here. In other words, I gave you the equation for dn1 over dt1, the change in the population size of one species. But if species are in competition, we would expect that there needs to be a reciprocal equation where we're looking at the change of the population size of the second species. We'd be asking what is the solution of dn sub 2 over dt, and it would just be the opposite, right? I won't go into the details of the mathematics here, but the Lotka-Volterra equations, there's two equations now, predict a number of different possible outcomes depending on the relative starting sizes of populations, on the relative growth rates of populations, and based on the relative competition coefficients. But in general, almost every solution for the Lotka-Volterra equation actually predicts that in the long run, if one species has any competitive advantage at all, even if it's only a slight advantage, then it will drive the other species to extinction. In other words, the Lotka-Volterra equations suggest that if there's any competition, then we can't have a stable ecological interaction. One species will be eliminated from the community. Now, this conclusion of the Lotka-Volterra equations is not satisfying because it belies our impression of the real world. In the real world, we often see species that appear to be using the same resources and that are apparently competing with each other. Clearly, the Lotka-Volterra equations, while providing a framework for thinking about how we can model the effects of interspecific competition, fall short of providing a complete model of the interaction between species. Now, that conclusion shouldn't be surprising or dismaying to us. We've seen with all of the equations for population growth we've looked at so far that they're only approximations and that we only rarely ever see real populations conforming to those models, although the logistic growth equation is probably the best we've come up with. So the question we're left with then is, how does competition affect the abundance and distribution of species in the real world? In other words, why does the Lotka-Volterra equation fall short? This is the question that we're going to turn to in the next lecture.